Okay, well, welcome everybody, and to give bees a chance, it's my pleasure to introduce Howard Griffiths.
Hi there and good evening. Welcome to the wonderfully titled webinar, Give Bees a Chance. And the subtitle to that is How Can We Help Bees and Feed the World? Now, just a little housekeeping as we start. Please note that this event is being recorded and that the audience and microphones and cameras will be turned off throughout. And so you'll be able to communicate with the participants, the speakers, by using the Q&A function, and you can put questions to the panel at any point from now by typing into that Q&A panel, okay? And if you can include your location when you put in your question, we'd love to know where you are, okay? Now, I'd just firstly like to acknowledge the sponsors of this, this webinar, which has been organised by the University of Cambridge as part of the Annual Food Agenda project, and also supported by our Global Food Security and Compliance Hub. The Annual Food Agenda is an outreach and communication project which is supported by the EIT Food, which is Europe's leading food innovation initiative. And we're working to make the food system more sustainable, healthy and trusted. So we're bringing together key players across Europe to the food sector, from industry to research institutions, and we're looking to guide innovation and with a range of partner organisations and over 50 startups from 16 EU member states. So we're really pleased to be part of this major initiative. Now, tonight, I'd like to introduce you to our panel. And I'm going to, at this point now, to, I think we'll see them in real time. How does that go? There we are. I think we can see everybody now. Excellent, right. So we have, on our panel tonight, we have Professor Dave Goulson, who's a Professor of Biological Sciences at Sussex University and the founder of the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, an author of many popular books, and somebody's going to win 2 of those books tonight. Really exciting. And then we have Lynn Dix, Dr. Lynn Dix, who's a lecturer in animal ecology at the University of Cambridge. And Lynn is a conservation scientist and works at the interface between agroecology, policy, and the food and farming industry. Next, we have Hamish Symington, who's a PhD student who is working on pollination and plant-pollinator interactions at the University of Cambridge, with a particular focus on strawberries. And last but not least, we have Tom Clark, who's a nature-friendly, well, he calls himself an accidental 4th-generation farmer, which is an amazing tradition and growing sugar beet, cereals, potatoes, and linseed near Ely. And Tom will hopefully tell us a little bit about some of the major initiatives he has to encourage pollinators in his farming. So to start off with, we're going to have a brief introduction from each of our panelists for 4 to 5 minutes or so. And then after that 20-minute period, we will then open up for questions and either between the panelists or from you, the audience. So that's how the evening will proceed. So first of all, I'm going to ask Dave to start off. And I've got a question for you, Dave. It's, can gardens really contribute to conserving biodiversity?
Just remember to turn my microphone on. It always helps, doesn't it? Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a really exciting opportunity here, actually, because there's an appetite, I think, and a growing one for wilding our gardens, for encouraging wildlife and inviting it in to live with us in our cities. There are 22 million gardens in the UK, covering an area. It's about 500,000 hectares. It's a bigger area than all of our nature reserves put together. And that's without counting all the other kind of urban green spaces, the road verges, the roundabouts, the parks, the cemeteries, and so on and so on. So there's a kind of ready-made network there. And just imagine that all of that was being managed in a kind of sensitive, wildlife-friendly way, with lots of flowers in the road verges and the roundabouts and in the gardens and so on and so on. It could support an awful lot of biodiversity. There's a really interesting long study done by a lady called Jenny Owen, who lived in Leicester and has a little garden of about 1/8 of an acre, and she spent 35 years trying to catalogue every creature that she could find in that garden. And it obviously took her a while, but she eventually got to a total of 2,700 species or thereabouts in one tiny little, not particularly exciting urban garden. About 2,000 of those were different types of insect. So there's astonishing biodiversity already living in our urban areas. And we know, for example, that the higher densities of bumblebee nests in urban areas than in most farmland, and that bumblebee nests grow faster if they're placed in urban areas than they do if they're placed in most farmland. But there's obviously lots of room for improvement, and some gardens are pretty awful for wildlife. So while some people are enthusiastically planting flowers for bees and putting up bee hotels and all the rest of it, there are other people putting down astroturf and hard decking and using lots of pesticides. And actually a lot of gardening practices can be quite harmful to the environment. So it's critical kind of how we garden. You know, use of peat, disposable plastic pots, lots of fertilizers and pesticides in our gardens and so on. It's possible to garden in a really un-environmentally friendly way. But equally, it's very easy with a little bit of knowledge to garden in a way that supports a huge diversity of life. And that's kind of, it's become a bit of a mission for me in recent years, is trying to encourage people to maximize the wildlife value of their garden.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Dave. That's a really nice introduction. I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions coming up next. Now I'm going to move over to Lynn, and I'm going to ask you, Lynn, so how important are wild bees for food production?
Hi there, everyone. Thanks for the question, Howard. I'd start with answering that question by saying that bees and other pollinators are really important to food production worldwide, and generally that's the starting point. In fact, 3/4 of all the world's major food crops are dependent on pollination to some extent to produce their seeds or their fruit. But actually, only 1/3 of the food produced by volume is pollinator dependent to some extent, and that's because when you look at the amount of food, quite a lot of the bulk of it is actually cereal crops or staples, and those things like wheat and barley, they're wind pollinated, so they don't need insect pollinators to produce the fruit. So that 1/3 of all the food produced in the world that's pollinator dependent is where you get this 1 in 3 mouthfuls is reliant on pollinators statement from. It's kind of based on evidence. But all the different crops don't have the same level of dependence on pollination. So some crops are very, very dependent and can't actually produce their fruits or seeds without any pollinators. Cocoa is one of those, for instance, or Brazil nut, vanilla. But there are other crops that are pollinator dependent for which they can actually have yield without pollination, but the pollination boosts the yield by 10% to 20%. And examples of those are oilseed rape, for example, and palm oil as well is one that has a lesser increase in yield as a result of pollination. So when you take that into account, the actual dependence of food production on pollination is more like between 5% and 8% of all the food produced in the world comes directly as a result of visits to the flowers by insects and usually bees. So it's more like 1 in 20 mouthfuls. But in fact, when how much your own food is dependent on pollination depends a lot on your diet. If you just eat donuts, then they just have sugar and starch, and you don't have any need for pollination to produce those donuts, except that you have to fry them. So if you fry them in a vegetable oil like that's made from oilseed rape, then there is a dependence for the oil. If you fry them in lard, you just eat donuts fried in lard, then the lard comes from pigs, and they do have a dependence, but it's much more indirect because they might need some vegetable proteins, which would be from pulses, so in their own food. So it's a lot less clear how dependent. As soon as you put strawberry jam inside your donut, then you've got a dependence on pollination because of the strawberries, which depend in an intermediate way for their fruit on pollinators. Something like a middling, about half of the yield, say, is dependent on pollination for strawberries. And in fact, the healthier your diet becomes, the more you depend on pollination, because I think all the fruits and vegetables that make up our 5 a day, many of those are pollinator dependent. Lots of nuts, the vegetable oils, the unsaturated fats you might want to include in your diet, the pulses for vegetable protein, a lot of those are dependent on pollination. So the healthier you are, the more you depend on pollination. question was actually about how important wild bees are to food production. So if we look at, we've talked about how dependent all food production is. Who's delivering that? It's mostly bees, but it's a whole variety of different species, and it also includes flies. So for some crops, flies are more important pollinators. Oilseed rape, for instance, is visited by a whole range of different insects, including flies and wasps, and sometimes bugs and beetles, and there are many things. Scientists would, it's quite hard to put a figure on how much of it's coming from wild insects that live freely in the environment and how much pollination is delivered by managed bees like honeybees and managed bumblebees. But if you ask most scientists in this field, they would say generally about half of the value worldwide of pollination is coming from wild insects, and about half is coming from managed bees, which farmers or beekeepers will introduce into the crops. So how important are wild bees to food production? About half of 1 in 20 mouthfuls of your food and more if you're healthy in your diet.
Okay, thanks very much, Lynn. Now, temporarily, we've Hamish is just Hamish is back from the blue yonder. So, Hamish, I've got a question for you. If you can unmute yourself, and you can tell us perhaps how you use bees in your experiments in the Department of Plant Sciences.
Certainly, that's a great question, Howard. Thanks. So my research involves food security. I'm trying to find ways to increase crop production. I'll give you a bit of a background first before I tell you about my bees. The problem I'm coming at is that the current world population is about 7.5 billion, and that's predicted to increase to 10 billion by 2050. And we won't be able to find that much more farmland to grow crops. So we're going to need to farm more intensively to produce food for all of those people. And that will put pressure on the insects providing pollination services, like Lynn was talking about. As you've probably heard, the numbers of those insects are generally in decline around the world. It depends what you look at, but they're generally in decline. So it's reconciling the concept for the conflict between needing more pollinators, but not having quite so many. And people like Dave and Lynn are working on understanding how the landscape affects insect populations, but I'm coming at things from the plant angle. So if we can find what it is that insects like about flowers, then perhaps we can make the plants more efficient at being pollinated, so we can make better use of those insects. Now, traditional plant breeding is focused on producing crops which have a better yield or disease resistance or shelf life or taste, but without any focus on what's important for pollinators. And this sometimes means that important characteristics are lost in the crops, or the flowers aren't as good as they could be for the pollinators. Bees have pretty poor eyesight, so whatever we can do to help bees find flowers will be useful. And that's where my research comes in. So I'm looking at flowers from strawberry plants, and I've been to a strawberry farmer's field and I've taken photographs of nearly 2,000 flowers from 21 different varieties of strawberry. And from those photographs, I can look at particular things to do with the shape of the flowers. So things like their size, or how wiggly their edges are, or how cup-shaped the flowers are. And then based on my measurements, I can make pairs of plastic models which differ in only one way and use those to see if it affects how fast bees can find the flowers. So in the experiment I'm doing at the moment, I've made lots of these little plastic flowers, and I've got them here. I'll put them in front of my face, and then Zoom won't make them into a virtual background. They both have the same area, which is the average area of all of the flowers I measured. But this one has rounder petals on the ends, and this one has pointier ends to its petals. And the wiggliness of this outline is also informed by the flowers that I measured. So this one falls right at the bottom end of the wiggliness, and this one is right at the top. So in our lab, we have a bumblebee room, and we've got colonies of bumblebees which we've bought, and they've never seen real flowers. And I can use those bumblebees to test these plastic flowers. So I can train a bee that one of these little round white things contains a sugar reward. That training takes about 20 minutes. And then I can perform the experiment. It's pretty simple. I put 3 of these in a triangle about 60 centimeters apart, let out the bee, and let her find one of the flowers. And then when she leaves it, I can time how long it takes her to find the next one. And after she's done several trips with that, I switch them over to the wiggly edge flowers and let her do exactly the same thing, timing how long it takes between leaving one flower and finding the next. And if I do that enough times with enough bees, I'll be able to say whether wiggly edge flowers or smooth edge flowers are easier to find, or if there's no difference between them. I'm about a third of the way through that experiment at the moment, so I can't tell you the result yet, but watch this space and I'll tell you another time. Another aspect of our work is seeing how plants reward insects for visiting. So plants produce nectar and pollen, which the insects use as food, but there haven't been very many studies looking at how much nectar and pollen different varieties of the same crop produce. And a couple of years ago, Emily, a researcher in our lab, was working on flowers of field bean, which is used to feed cattle. And her work gave a rather surprising result that there was a big variation in the amount of nectar produced by bean varieties, and also in the sugariness of that nectar. Now, some varieties of bean didn't produce any nectar at all, so there's no sugar reward for the insects that visit it in this enormous great crop. And before Emily looked at nectar production in beans, people assumed they all produce the same amount. So I'm going to be doing the same study in strawberry in the coming summer. And even if it turns out that we can't make flowers easier for insects to find, then we could still make them more rewarding when the insects get there. And that means they'll have more food to take back to their nests. Very briefly, I just wanted to mention that we've also been finding out what bees do when they return to their nest. So when a bumblebee gets back, a foraging bee vomits up the nectar that she's drunk into a little wax pot for the other bees in the colony to drink. And the more sugary the nectar, the more energy it contains, but also the harder it is to drink because it's thicker. And there's a balance between these two. And it's been known for a while that the most energy efficient concentration for drinking is about 58% sugar. But no one had ever looked at how sugar concentration affected the speed of vomiting. So I spent an enjoyable few months feeding bees different concentrations of sugar and watching them be sick. And that showed that the concentration affected vomiting speed quite a lot more than it affects drinking speed, but also that vomiting is much faster than drinking. And you might have seen this in the news. It made the New York Times, but there is a serious point to it. If we're going to be trying to breed crops which are better for the insects which visit them, then we need to know about the mechanics of bee feeding so we don't spend time trying to improve the wrong thing. I hope that gives you a bit of an idea about the research I do. Looking forward to your questions.
Thanks very much, Hamish. That's a great introduction. And hear about your performing bees. Wonderful. I'm now going to ask Tom, and indeed, actually, we've already had a question in, Tom, that I think you're going to be able to address from Tracy. So, but you're going to tell us, what is a nature-friendly farmer?
What is a nature-friendly farmer? Well, I would. It's a bit of a liberty to call myself a nature-friendly farmer. I would suggest that that most farmers care about the land, and they're in it for the long term. As you said, I'm a fourth-generation farmer now. And I think most farmers would want to do the right thing and pass on their farm and the natural environment in a good state for the next generation. I suppose what makes me specifically a nature-friendly farmer is that I'm trying to do things that actually prove that farmers can enhance nature and enhance the environment on their farms at the same time as producing lots of good quality food. And I think there's been a narrative in recent years that you can have one or the other. And I guess what nature-friendly farming is all about is proving that you can do both at the same time. And in fact, actually, you can't really have one without the other. And I think that's what we've heard from some of the panelists already is actually, food production and food security rely on the natural environment as its foundation. And actually, you couldn't have farming is a livelihood. So if farms don't make a sustainable living for the farmers involved, and then they can't afford to put in the measures that inevitably don't make so much money for them in terms of looking after nature as well. So there is a codependency there, and that's what we're really exploring. So we've got here on the farm outside Ely, we've got about 1,000 acres. And we've got about 15% of our land is in environmental measures. We've got pollen and nectar strips, which have been specially sown. We've got floristically enhanced buffer zones around the fields. We're planting things like daisy-type flowers and teasels. And we're allowing things like thistles to grow, whereas perhaps in the past we wouldn't have done, which are all valuable sources of nectar for pollinators. I would say, actually, what Lynn was saying earlier, actually, our farm doesn't really rely on bees or pollinators for our crops. We grow wheat, which is wind pollinated, and sugar beet, which doesn't flower at all in our crop. They do where they're grown for seed, but not when we grow them for sugar. We grow linseed, which is largely self-pollinating, and potatoes, which they do flower, but that's nothing to do with whether you get a potato out of the bottom of them or not. So, I'm not doing this for my crop. I'm doing this for the overall health of the environment in which I'm farming. And again, Lynn mentioned, you know, bees aren't the bee's knees. they're not the only pollinator game in town. And a lot of our crops benefit from hoverflies, for example, which also predate, as in they hunt and kill and eat insects, which would otherwise sap our crops. So actually, there's lots of other benefits other than just pollinating our crops. And that's what nature-friendly farming is all about. And around Ely, we have a group of 22 now farmers who are all joined up. We call ourselves the Ely Nature-Friendly Farming Zone. We're sharing with each other all the measures we're putting in place on our farms and sharing knowledge about how best to implement them, how best to manage them. And we're also bringing experts in to talk to us about how we can do better. And we also want to share what we're doing with the general public as well, so that everyone knows that you can live in an intensively farmed area like the Cambridgeshire Fens, but still there's a lot of work going on there, a lot of nature actually still there. And nature-friendly farming is good for both.
Okay, Tom, thank you very much. That's a really great start there from all of our panelists and really set the scene tremendously. And we're having a huge number of questions coming in. And a little bit, it's a wonderful selection. Lynn, there was one I think that you said you'd like to have a tackle. Is that, can I, about, where can I see that one? There was one that said, Lynn's going to answer this question live. Adrian, should planting for pollinators be targeted at specific species?
Okay, I can have a go at that one. So the answer is you need to think about the species you want to support, because different types of pollinator need different plants. There are some plants that are quite good for a lot of pollinators, but there are also lots of pollinators, especially those which are declining, like lots of species of solitary bee and a good number of bumblebee species, which have particularly specialist requirements for habitat or even for individual types of flowers. So there are plenty of solitary bee species, for instance, that need yellow composite flowers, or some that there's at least one that relies on scabious or devil's bit scabious to collect pollen, and that's the only type of pollen it will collect. So if you care about those species, then you need to think about which actual flower species they want. If you care about bumblebees, then you have some bumblebee species that have long tongues and are generally prefer, or are not entirely restricted, but they prefer to forage on flowers with long petals, long corolla tubes is the technical term. So things like red clover, which has a particularly long flower and also quite protein-rich pollen, is really important in a landscape, especially for long-tongued bumblebees. And it's quite a lot of the declining bumblebee species are ones that have long tongues, although we also have two common bumblebee species that have long tongues, which is the common carder bee and the garden bumblebee. So it really depends on what you care about. Do you care about conservation, looking after species that are threatened, or do you care about pollination service, looking after the common bumblebees and other bees and insects that are pollinating crops? It does matter. I'll stop there.
Thanks. Can I come across to Dave and draw you in? Because there's some other questions that relate to this really about what should gardeners do. And there's another question from, I'm trying to see, Maggie, asking about options for lawns. And I wonder what you'd like to suggest for folk from your, what do you tell us from your books?
Yeah, this is terrible, but forgive the blatant self-publicizing, but I've got a new book coming out called Gardening for Bumblebees in April 2021, which you can pre-order from Waterstones online. Anyway, sorry. There's lots of positive things you can easily do in a garden. The most obvious one is growing pollinator-friendly flowers. And there's lots of advice out there, including YouTube videos from me and my books, but many other sources that are pretty accurate. The RHS publishes a list of plants that are good for pollinators as well. And it's nice, as Lynn said, to try and provide a variety of flowers that cater for both short-tongued insects and long-tongued bumblebees and so on, and to try and provide a continuity of flowering from early spring through to summer, although that's, unless you've got an enormous garden, it's pretty difficult. But don't get too hung up on that. Just the more flowers, the better generally. And obviously it's a big subject, but as a rule of thumb, old-fashioned kind of cottage garden flowers tend to be really good. Herbs are mostly very good. As I say, it's easy to find lots of information. When it comes to lawns, we Brits do have this sort of slight tendency to try to recreate a Wimbledon tennis court in our back garden, you know, this obsession with mowing backwards and forwards to create stripes. And my dad does it. He's 88 and he still tries to mow his lawn every couple of weeks. And there's just no need to do that. And if we could just sort of persuade people to be a bit more relaxed about, you know, mowing less often. It's amazing how many flowers are already in most lawns, unless it's a brand new lawn, that will spring up and flower if you just stop mowing. So if we could all just kind of, you know, when you start twitching and think the lawn's looking a bit long, try and calm down, make yourself a coffee or a gin and tonic or whatever, and go and sit down in a deck chair and appreciate the flowers rather than wanting to mow the hell out of it. And also be more tolerant of weeds. So, you know, we obsessively try to destroy things like thistles and ragwort and dandelions and so on in our gardens, but they're native wildflowers. They're rather beautiful and they're really good for insects. So being a bit more tolerant can only be a good thing.
Okay, thanks. And what about sort of, I guess that the sort of wildflower areas that have been, I mean, even some of the Cambridge colleges have turned over huge areas of some of their pristine lawns to wildflower. So I think we can all try to do a little bit of that maybe in our own backyard as well. Okay, I'm going to move on. There's been some questions, several questions coming up we've got one from Katie, another from Adrian, another one from Andy about the competition between wild bees and the honeybees that people keep. So I think if we start with Hamish on that one and then perhaps come back to Lynn between you. Okay, Hamish, you can
unmute certainly. Yeah, certainly. I'm only working on bumblebees at the moment, or I'm using bumblebees as a model organism because they're really easy to work with. We can just buy them in a small buzzing cardboard box. And the lessons which we can learn with bumblebees are relatively translatable to the other ones. In my spare time, I'm also a beekeeper, and I've got 3 hives, but it is something which I do with caution, because a hive of honeybees needs about an acre or so of flowers to be able to survive. That's just, I think it's just over half a standard size football pitch. And that's a nectar and pollen resource which is being taken away from wild insects which need them. So it's something which I'm slightly nervous about. And I don't like the idea of transporting my honeybees to a crop to pollinate it, when it could be quite a lot better of an idea to encourage native bees onto the farms. I think Dave and Lynn is probably going to have more to say on the conflict between honeybees and wild bees than me.
Okay, thanks very much.
She'll probably tell me to stop beekeeping as well.
Sure she won't. Lynn.
Yeah, I'd love to come in there. So I actually trained to do beekeeping when I was in my early 20s and then decided not to do it for that reason. Honeybees, the first thing to say is honeybees are native to Europe, but the ones that are kept in this country now mostly are not really. They're hybrids of various subspecies from other parts of Europe. They're not native at all to the USA, so they're completely feral or non-native there. And some people would even describe them as an invasive alien species, because they've really swept through the whole of the Americas, and they're not native at all. They're doing very well in South America now. They're also not declining. They're increasing globally. They're declining in some countries, but if you look at the number of managed colonies in a lot of countries and take the whole world and look at that, they're increasing. They're doing quite well. In fact, it almost looks like we're kind of replacing the pollination service that was delivered by wild insects. There was a paper published earlier this year by a Spanish ecologist called Carlos Herrera, and he drew together a whole load of data sets on what the pollinator community looked like, or the bee community looked like around the Mediterranean from many different countries. And 50 years ago, about 1/5 of all the bees visiting flowers in all these studies were honeybees, and now it's half. So the numbers, at least the proportion of the community that is wild in the Mediterranean countries has declined a lot, and that's gone along with a gradual and ongoing increase in the number of honeybee colonies. So there's quite a bit of evidence coming through that honeybees actually displace wild bees. And that's because of that. It's partly because of the amount of resource they use, the competition that Hamish was talking about. A single honeybee colony, 5,000 to 10,000 bees, it's like the equivalent of 20 big bumblebee colonies. You know, it's a lot of insects feeding. But there's another issue, which is there's a lot of new research on this at the moment. So it's not quite clear what the scale of the effect is, but honeybees and wild bees and even other pollinators like hoverflies share diseases. They share diseases, and the diseases are spread between them partly through shared food resources. So on flowers, if you look at flowers, you can actually pick up genetic signals of diseases that are in wild bees and honeybees on the flowers. So when they're sharing resources, they're spreading disease. And one of the diseases that's particularly well known about is deformed wing virus. And that's something that makes honeybees have deformed wings so they can't fly, and does the same thing to wild bees. And it's carried in a range of different species now. And it does seem to spread between honeybees and wild bees. This is something that has increased in honeybee colonies because it's vectored by the Varroa mite. So if you're a beekeeper, you'll know about the Varroa mite. It's almost ubiquitous in the UK now. It's something that beekeepers all have to manage, and it can really overwhelm a honeybee colony if it's left unchecked or untreated. It vectors deformed wing virus. So the more honeybees you have, the more you're exposing the wild population to deformed wing virus and other diseases. And the actual scale of that as part of this problem is, I think we're still working it out. There's quite a lot of new science on this at the moment.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Lynn. Now there's a couple of questions coming in that I think are relevant for Tom. There's been one asking I think it was from Ilona from the Netherlands, asking quite a kind of a policy-based question about how we can, you're obviously working with a group of farmers who are like-minded in terms of trying to develop conservation strategies, but she's asking, how can you make more farmers think about the conservation biodiversity element of it, rather than just thinking about producing food?
It's a good question. I'm not sure I have actually got the answer, but there is a new policy coming through from the government, and it's going to be replacing all of our, so up until now, under the Common Agricultural Policy, all farmers or landowners have been paid a per hectare sum of money just for keeping the land in what they call good agricultural and environmental condition. That's basically what they call farm subsidies. And that system is being withdrawn in the UK over the next 7 years. We've had some more details on that, and it's going to be nearly half or more gone by 2024. And in place of that, the government is proposing to spend the same amount of money, but targeting it to reward farmers for what they call public goods, which is, among other things, more biodiversity, more reducing pollution and reducing carbon footprint and things like that. So there is a very new policy in the works coming through. And going back to something Dave said earlier on about the things people use in their gardens, some of the chemicals you can buy to use in your gardens from the garden centre are banned on farms already. So, you know, it's not just the farmers that need to look after nature, it's everybody needs to do their part as well.
Okay, thanks very much, Tom. Now I've got a general question. I'm not sure who'd like to pick up on this, but there's been several, and there's one from Lauren, I think I may know Lauren, Barbara and Mark, and the questions are all around whether, and I think we'll start off with Dave on this one, whether there's an advantage in planting native plants or non-native plants if we are trying to encourage bees and pollinators.
Yeah, there's some evidence that on average, native plants are slightly more attractive to pollinators than non-natives, but it's not terribly convincing. And actually, pollinators don't care too much where a plant comes from. They tend to be quite adaptable. Bumblebees learn very quickly. And as long as there's a nectar reward that they can get to or a pollen reward they can get to, they don't care if the plant's from South America or Timbuktu. So there's no need to get too hung up on it from a pollinator's perspective, although there are some examples of plants that are completely useless. For example, some plants that people grow that are adapted to pollination by hummingbirds in South America are not much good for pollinators in the UK because they can't reach the nectar, for example. But the real advantage of natives, I think, comes more when you move beyond thinking about pollinators and think about other insect diversity, because there are many herbivorous insects in the UK. Think about the caterpillars of butterflies, for example, all of which have specific host plants. Most herbivorous insects tend to be quite specific in what they'll eat. So, for example, common blue butterflies tend to lay their eggs on bird's foot trefoil, and that's what the caterpillars eat. So unless you have bird's foot trefoil in your garden, you won't ever get breeding common blue butterflies. Or if you have lady's smock, you might be lucky enough to have orange tip butterflies breeding in your garden. So if you include native plants wherever you can, then you increase the numbers of these herbivorous insects, many of which are beautiful. Sorry, I apologize, someone's using a food processor in the background here. So there's certainly, I think, wherever, my sort of rule of thumb is if I can think of a native species that will do the job or will fit that bit of the garden, then I'll go for it. But I don't get too hung up on trying to exclusively grow native plants.
Okay, thanks. Lynn, do you want to come in on that, or?
I don't have anything particular to add, except that there are definitely some non-native plants that are very, very nectar rich, like Himalayan balsam.
Yeah, okay.
But the bees they feed need a diversity of flowers and they for a healthy diet. So on its own, it's good.
Okay, there's been some interest. There's a number of questions coming. I think one from Ikeman and Tim, and another one from Ben. And these are all about what are the best ways to encourage not sort of bumblebees or solitary bees in our gardens. And I think that some of the questions involve around whether we should ungarden or leave areas not farmed, and others relate to whether we should try and set up a bee hotel or other sorts of, what sort of nesting areas can we prepare? So I think I'm just going to throw that open and see who's going to pick up that challenge to tackle all of those areas. Okay, Dave, we'll start with you.
I'll give it a go. So first, the bees basically need two things. They need floral resources, flowers, and they need somewhere to nest. And providing them with nest sites is often quite difficult. You can buy bumblebee nest boxes, but they tend not to work. And I think largely a waste of money. They're really good woodlice houses and earwig houses and so on, but not so popular with bumblebees. The solitary bee hotels that are commonly bought, they do work. There are a small selection of species that like to nest, the solitary bees, where the females like to nest in horizontal holes, particularly red mason bees occupy bee hotels. But there are others too. You can, if you're lucky, get maybe 10 species in them. And they're quite successful. There's a bit of controversy. Some people argue that you can do more harm than good by, if you have a big bee hotel, you get an accumulation of parasites, things like pollen mites and cuckoo bees and so on. And that could do more harm than good. I think the best option is to have several small bee hotels. But I don't worry too much about these other creatures because they're also part of biodiversity. And I think, pollen mites deserve a home just as much as bees do, really. So otherwise, it's quite difficult to provide homes for many of the solitary bees and other pollinators deliberately. But my feeling is that if you provide the flowers, usually they'll find somewhere to nest. So it comes back to the floral resources, I would say. I don't know whether any of the other panelists have more they'd like to add on that one. Lynn?
Oh yeah, so a couple of things I wanted to add. Some of the best bumblebee nesting habitats I know of are piles of rubble, piles of junk and piles of rubbish, compost heaps. And one thing which we all need to do if we want to look after wild bees is just get a bit less tidy, be a bit messy, leave some stuff lying around. And piles of bricks are quite great for bumblebees. And queen bumblebees are really easy to find looking for nesting sites in the spring in piles of bricks. So I'm an advocate.
Old compost heaps too. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. And the other thing I wanted to say was we were talking about lawns earlier, and there are actually quite a few species of solitary bee that nest in lawns, and they quite like to nest in short cut lawns. Andrena fulva, the tawny mining bee, is one of those. And they make little nests in the ground. They tend to be quite deep, but it really means if you're looking after a lawn, you need to be very careful about using any kind of chemicals on it, because it's likely that bees nesting in the ground in your lawn will be exposed to those.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to come back to. Can I come back to Tom? Oh, sorry, Hamish, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say on that note, as a beekeeper, I often get called out to try to remove, well, I get called out to remove swarms of honeybees, but people often try to call me to remove bumblebee nests and things like that. You can't really move a bumblebee nest. It will die out in about August, September time when the new queens have come out and they'll be off finding somewhere else. If you have a bumblebee nest in your garden, you can't really move it, but congratulations, you have a bumblebee nest in your garden. Keep it as nice, as happy as you can, and then do whatever it is you need to do over winter instead.
Okay, brilliant. I'm going to start with Tom, then I'm going to have a follow-up question for you, Tom. So, Tom, how do you think in a farming landscape we can tackle some of these issues about this, leaving these habitats where we might get both solitary bees and bumblebees to come along? What actions are you taking at the moment?
So we leave specifically to help pollinators. We leave uncultivated strips next to our fields, and that sort of bare earth provides places, it's going to be undisturbed that burrowing bees can use, and that's good. But also we're in the fen, so we don't have a lot of pasture land, but we do have we have a river running next to our farm, and we have the riverbanks, and on that we have very low levels of livestock grazing, and they create a sort of tussocky grassland, which, as Lynn says, I'm really a very untidy farmer, and allow sort of scrub to creep up and empty corners. A lot of fields are irregularly shaped, and all the farm equipment is best used in straight lines. So one of the things we've done is to get more crops off a nice square area in the middle of a field, and use all the awkward corners and the unproductive bits and the bits that have never cropped well, or the bits with bad drainage, and leave them out of the cropping, get more crops and more consistent crops needing less fertilizer or pesticides on them to get a really good crop. And all the little wiggly bits around the edges you can leave for nature, or even for, which is often better, deliberately cultivated strips for pollinators or wildlife. And okay, that's what we're doing. Yeah.
Thanks, Tom. What about? There's a couple of questions that have come in from. There was one from Neil, who was interested in forestry and afforestation. There was another one from the Romsey beekeepers, and they were asking about hedgerows. And I'm just wondering what advice you can give us for the sort of planting trees or planting hedges or encouraging hedgerows and vegetation associated with it, and whether that's also a strategy that you'd adopt. And perhaps what advice would you give to a forester who's about to plant a new plantation?
Is that to me?
Yeah.
Well, you've come to the wrong place. So I farm in the fens, and we don't really have, our fields are divided up with drainage ditches, so we really don't have a hedge on the farm. So,
but I bet those drainage ditches are good habitats for bees and so on. So I'll come to Dave then. Can you take this one? What would you advise a forester? And also, what about the other question that's come up? And I'm not sure I've got the name on this, but Tim, I think, was asking about verges and seed mixes for verges. So there's a lot about councils now. Let's deal with trees first of all. How can we reforest areas and encourage bees?
Okay, so Han, let me deal with the hedge one first. Hedges can be fantastic habitat, particularly providing early season flowers. Commonly in the UK, there'll be blackthorn and hawthorn in hedges, both of which, if the hedge isn't cut too often, or you cut one side one year and the other side a couple of years later, then they'll flower, and they flower early in the year when there isn't too much else flowering, and they're really good for many early species of solitary bee and queen bumblebees and so on. Also, if you leave some willows in a hedge as standards to grow out of it to flower, they're really fantastic pollen resources. And also you get things like bramble later in the year, and ivy. Sorry, holly and the ivy, it's Christmas. Ivy is a fantastic resource for bees too, and birds like the berries. So hedges generally, of course, and we all know this, I think, are pretty good for wildlife, as long as they're not cut too viciously. I did see the question that was about Scottish forestry, and I don't think any of us are experts on Scottish forestry and what you should plant, but I did used to live in Scotland, and most of the bee life associated with the north of Scotland, where this chap is from, is not associated particularly with woodland, but with woodland clearings and open areas. It's associated particularly with the heather and the heathland and the bilberries, which don't grow in dense woodland, but grow in sunnier areas. So ensuring that that's in good condition and not I mean, if plantation forestry is not really particularly good for pollinators or any other wildlife, in my experience.
So the answer is surely, because we're all being encouraged at the moment to plant trees in order to sequester carbon, is that, again, a mixed strategy whereby we have spaces left along the sides of rivers, along open spaces left where some of the natural vegetation can continue to flower, will continue to provide the sorts of habitats, and also planting along the edge some of these flowering trees. There was a question about tree pollen. How useful that is. I don't know whether I might just quickly say, probably because many trees are wind pollinated, I'm not so certain. Hamish, what would you say about tree pollen?
So there are various different trees which are important to bees. Lime is a particularly big one, and also the ivy that grows up them. It's a very important late source of pollen and nectar. So you'll, even now there are honeybees and other insects visiting them. Yeah, things which have catkins, they're all wind pollinated, but there are an awful lot of trees which are useful at this time of year.
Yeah. Okay. So now I've got a specific question for you, Hamish. It comes from Jemima Griffin, and who is 9.
Okay.
And she says, "What do bees do when wasps come to steal their honey?"
That is a great question. So wasps are another animal which hibernates over winter, a bit like the queen bumblebees. You get a queen wasp which will hibernate over winter. They don't need honey over winter because it's just one wasp surviving. But honeybees don't hibernate. They keep their body temperature up to about 36 centigrade over winter, which is why they make honey. They need something to eat and burn their food. Wasps will come and steal honey from honeybees in the summer because they're hungry and they want something to eat in the summer. Now you'll have a load of guard bees at the front of the front of the honeybee hive, and they will fight off wasps which come to visit them. But sometimes, and I've seen this happen, when too many wasps discover that there is a good honeybee hive full of lots of tasty honey, they can actually overwhelm the hive and kill off all of the bees which are inside and then go and eat it. It's quite sad. A way which some bees have developed, particularly over in Japan and other places which have different species to us. Let's say there's a hornet which comes into the hive to try to steal it. The bees will ball around the hornet. They'll form a ball around it and raise the temperature of the hornet above the temperature at which it can survive. And the bees can survive just slightly higher temperature than the hornet. So they'll kill the hornet by cooking it, essentially, which is quite fun.
Okay, thanks, Hamish. I'm going to come to Lynn, I think, now. There's been a question from Andy, and I saw an earlier question, and I apologise if I've lost the exact speaker. Andy's asking about climate change, and there's been another question about the overall decline of insects that's often reported. So perhaps you could sort of put those two together, Lynn, and give us your thoughts on this.
Can you tell me exactly what the question is about climate change? Because I can't see it at the moment.
To what extent will the range of various bees perhaps be altered by climate change? So will we see some new species moving in, and will we lose some species?
Well, the first thing to say is definitely bee ranges will be changing in response to climate change, and they already are. So for example, we have one new species in the UK which arrived a few years ago, I think, which is the violet carpenter bee, Xylocopa violacea. A huge solitary bee that looks like a big black queen bumblebee with incredible shimmering purple wings. Quite common in Southern Europe. You'll see it if you go there on holiday, but it's now in the UK, and I seem to remember it's seen frequently in the southern part of the UK, but I haven't seen it here myself. I will get very excited when I do. And so we have species coming in because it's getting warmer. It's quite a different view when you look at bumblebees. There's been some really intensive research on the distribution of bumblebees in both the US and Europe. And the reason we have good data on this is because of amateur naturalists recording them and collections in museums in the States. So we can go back 100 years and see how the distributions are changing. And it actually looks like the bumblebee distributions in Europe and the US are moving northwards at the southern edge of the range. And what you'd expect from climate change is that the northern edge of the range would also be moving northwards, but it's not in the bumblebee species. So it looks like the bumblebees range is shrinking as a result of climate change. We don't know exactly why they're not moving north, but it's possibly connected with lack of available habitat. So bumblebees are cold adapted. They do very well in cold. In fact, you find them right up in the Arctic Circle even. So they don't really do so well under climate change. Whereas other bees that are, I mean, the highest diversity of bees in the whole world is in the Mediterranean regions, the places in the kind of middle latitudes where it's very hot, dry in the summer and mild winters. That's where bees do best. There are many more bee species there than there are in the tropics. So as that kind of climate moves north under climate change, the bees will come with it as long as they're able to move, which they are quite good at.
Thank you, Lynn. Okay, well, there's been an interesting suggestion here from JJ Gladwin about sort of range of plants that trees that should be planted. So that might address the question that Neil asked earlier about to line his plantations. Thank you for those suggestions of those flowering trees. There's been quite a bit of discussion in the Q&A session about coming back to ask us about this competition question between honeybees versus wild bees. And I think I'm going to pitch Dave against Hamish at this point. And I'm going to ask, could you just come back and give us a consensus, just a balanced view? What is the best way to manage, as a beekeeper, managing bees, but also sustaining wild bees? And from Dave, from a very activist in terms of promoting wild bees, to maintain their diversity. So let's start with Dave. We haven't heard from you for a bit.
Yeah, okay. I mean, this is a thorny one because on the whole, beekeepers, I have to say this, but it's true, are decent, nice people that care about the environment. I love honey myself. They're not evil. But we have to also acknowledge that too many honeybees in the wrong place is definitely a bad thing for wild insects. And so, I mean, I think it's a case of just using common sense and not putting honeybees in high density in the wrong places. So for example, I would say, and not everyone agrees with this, but that nature reserves should be for wild native insects and we shouldn't allow honeybees on nature reserves. Historically, they often have been placed on nature reserves because there's often lots of flowers, but I think that's a really foolish idea. But when it comes to arable crops, for example, where you have a field full of oilseed rape, it's a huge floral resource, then putting honeybee hives near that is great. It pollinates the crop, helps to pollinate the crop. And there's probably less of an issue of competition for food. So it depends where it is. And I think in farmland generally, I think that's be more appropriate to think about having honeybees, but that in wild native areas intended to conserve biodiversity, we should avoid honeybees.
Okay, thank you. Hamish?
Yeah, it's probably no surprise I agree with Dave. It's a bit like, I don't know, eating bacon or drinking alcohol or things like that. Everything in moderation, and that is why I only have a couple of hives rather than a load more. I do get very sad when I see things on Facebook or Twitter where it's saying that we've got this fabulous new nature reserve that we've got and our 10 honeybee hives lined up alongside it. And if you're going to be trying to introduce biodiversity into those nature reserves, then you need to take out the competition that's going to take away from that. So yeah, I think Dave gave a fabulous answer there.
Okay, thanks. Well,
sorry,
Dave.
Just one tiny thing. It's become very trendy in cities for people, particularly in London, to keep honeybees, often on balconies and roof terraces. And there's even a company that will essentially rent you a honeybee hive and give you some of its honey for a price. And it's reached a point where there are, the last count, something like 10,000 hives in central London, which is way, way more than it can support. So I would definitely discourage that kind of move towards beekeeping as a kind of trendy activity for yuppies.
Okay, well, there's been a comment from an anonymous attendee about slightly criticising this challenge I set for you, but it actually my response to that is there's been a lot of discussion in the Q&A session about this issue of the balance between wild bees and native bees, and I think we've heard that the best way to get a balance there. I would like to just give a quick shout out to Barbara, I think was from Scotland, Dufton, I think, who was very concerned about the building and the fact that that might be destroying natural habitats. And I hope you've been, perhaps you can recognise from some of the answers that if we can get the folk who've got new houses to encourage a little bit of untidiness in their gardens, then that may help those bees get re-established. I'm going to wrap up now. We've just got a couple of minutes left. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go around each of the panel, and they don't know what I'm going to ask them yet. So they're all now getting a little bit anxious. But what I'm going to say is, what have you learned from the other participants, either from the panel or from the chat, that you're going to change what you do, or you're going to do more of what you do as a result of what you've heard tonight? And I'm going to go down the order. I'll start with you, Dave.
Crikey. What am I going to do? Pass. Sorry, I can't think of anything sensible that I've gleaned. That sounds awful, doesn't it? I'll try and think of something while the others give brilliant answers.
Okay, Lynn, we'll come to you next.
I don't have a brilliant answer either, but I would say that I think that the conflict between honeybees and wild bees and beekeepers and conservationists is really not very good, and I don't want to fuel it. And so I'm going to learn from Dave about how to be more diplomatic and thoughtful in answers. And I'm trying to, because I don't think I agree that beekeepers are wonderful advocates for pollinators and insects generally. The ones I've met tend to be people that love insects, and they love learning about other insect species, and they love looking after them. So it's a challenging conservation conflict, and I'm going to be more determined to communicate about it more clearly.
Thank you, Lynn. That's a call for tolerance. Brilliant. Hamish, let's come to you.
So we've talked a lot today about lots of different species of bees. There are 7 apis honeybees around the world, 260 species of bumblebee, and there's about 20,000 species of other bees. So bumblebees and honeybees are actually a really tiny subset of what we've been talking about today. So I'm still doing my PhD. At some point I need to write all of this up and defend the experiments I've been doing. So I need to think more about how the research that I'm doing, how that can be translated into the effect on the other pollinators that we've been talking about, because that is indeed a really important issue.
Thank you. Okay, now Tom, you've had a little time.
Thank you. I think our next step is to try and measure more what actually the effects of the way we're farming in a nature-friendly way are, and find out which pollinators we're actually helping and which need more help and ways which we can do that. And I think our nature-friendly farming group would like to invite Lynn to come and speak to us and tell us how we can do it all better.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, excellent. Now, Dave, do you want to come in, or are you happy to
okay.
Sit on your hedge rather than sit on your fence?
One thing I do think we need to do more as scientists is talk more to Tom and farmers, because there's often not much dialogue between the two, and sometimes I'm no offense meant at all to the farming community that might be listening in, but sometimes people can demonize farmers as these terrible people spraying pesticides all over the place, and not realize, that they're actually, many of them, trying really hard to look after the environment. And maybe if we swap stories a bit and exchanged information, we might be able to, sort things out a bit.
Okay. Well, I'm going to draw things to close now. I'd like to thank, firstly, the audience, who have been fantastically diverse in the questions they've been asking. I'm sure some of our panel will take away these thoughts and try and think up answers for you. They've been amazingly diverse, and there's been a lot of commonality as well. So a lot of key concerns. I hope we've managed to address some of them. I'd like to thank Abigail Youngman and Carol Gonzalez Matos, who have helped through the EIT food program set up this AFA Food Agenda session tonight. And I think we've had a really stimulating time, and we've heard lots. I should remind you that Dave Goulson has very kindly offered 2 of his books, or maybe we're going to buy 2 of his books, and we're offering 2 of his books as prizes. They will be determined by some form of prize draw from all of you participants tonight. So we may well be contacting you and asking for addresses so we can send out your prizes. And then last but
already, Howard, the winners are announced already in the chat.
Oh, well, I'm just too slow. I've just been looking at all these.
Oh, maybe that was just for us. Sorry, I'll shut up.
Okay. Okay. You've thrown me there, Lynn. I'm just not sure which chat I should be looking at now. Oh yes, we've got Abigail Youngman to panelists. So I'm going to read this out because this is an important announcement. Thank you, Lynn. Competition winners. The competition winners are Sarah Carey and Henrik Sundergaard. Sunago, maybe. Anyway, welcome and congratulations to you both. And then finally, and last and not least at all in any way, we've had this magnificent panel tonight who've given us insight and understanding and also enthusiasm. I hope the dialogue that we've seen occurring between them and that tolerance is that for appreciating other people's points of view and then coming to a balanced view is really captures what is important about insects, looking after bees. And I'd really like to join, I hope you'll join with me in thanking Dave Coulson, Lynn Dix, Hamish Symington, and Tom Clark for the wonderful input we've had tonight. So thanks to you all and good night from here in Cambridge. Good night and Sussex.